Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this very special webinar on impact investment. Now, impact investment is a trend that just keeps defying expectation. Over a decade ago, leading organizations predicted that it was going to be that impact investment was going to be an emerging asset class that would reach maximum of $1 trillion in managed assets by 2020, a prediction that many at the time thought was overly optimistic, if anything. Now, in reality, by some estimates by the IFC, the value of managed assets in the year 2020 was valued at over $2 trillion. Trends like these are easy to contextualize through the lens of the rise of ESG investment, the global pandemic combined with social equality movements around the world, as well as alarming reports over the state of the environmental crisis, have all combined to put a renewed emphasis on initiatives that can truly make a difference, which is why investors turn to opportunities like impact investment. Now, can impact investment reasonably carry all that weight? Today, we will explore the current trends in this space, as well as examine issues such as whether sustainability reporting regimes and the EU taxonomy can further boost the environmental aspect of ESG. And we will also explore the governance and sustainability aspects that may not always get the attention they deserve, and how these three elements really interact with each other. Today, we are very happy to be joined by leading experts in the field. First and foremost, Veronika Akramovitz, partner at Baker McKenzie Warsaw. Veronika co-leads the Baker McKenzie's Mergers and Acquisitions Group and heads the International Commercial and Trade Team at Baker McKenzie Warsaw. Veronika also actively supports Polish businesses expanding abroad and impact investing projects, an investment strategy of companies and private equity funds that aims to generate ESG-specific effects and financial gains. We're also joined by Dr. Klaus-Dieter Bockhardt, Senior Energy Advisor at Baker McKenzie Brussels. He is a Senior Energy Advisor at the European and Competition Law Practice in the Baker McKenzie Brussels office. He joined quite recently, but previously worked for 33 years at the European Commission, including 4 years at the European Court of Justice. I would also like to welcome Jo Hewitt, partner at Baker McKenzie London, in the corporate department and advises clients on a wide range of corporate law matters. She is part of a dedicated team in London focused on international reorganizations and business transformation projects. Jo's practice also encompasses company law and corporate governance advisory work for private companies, including assisting clients to embed good corporate governance policies across their organizations. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to Silvio Cavallo, General Counsel at Pillarstone, a platform sponsored by KKR and established to partner with European banks to manage their exposure to non-core and underperforming assets. Pillarstone provides long-term capital and operational expertise to help the businesses that underpin these non-performing and non-core exposures stabilize, grow, and create value. Now, last but not least, we're joined by Kenza Lababi, SRI analyst at Mirova Impact Private Equity Firm. She is an ESG analyst within the research team in charge of ESG and impact assessments for the private equity firm. Prior to that, her experience was in other investment firms and with a background in financial markets, economics, and international affairs. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. As I understand it, Veronika, we have a very brief presentation from you to just set the tone and help us grasp some of the basic concepts in this novel field that is constantly evolving. So we're very happy to hear from you to just let us introduce these basic notions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris, for your kind introduction. And indeed, you just prepared basically one slide showing more or less the timeline that we speak about. So it started, and basically the aim of the slide, as I try to make it, something is not working on my screen at least. But basically speaking about ESG and E as the biggest winner in the current investment trend, this is aimed to just present you how the ESG interplays with the ambitions of the EU Green Deal and how the ESG disclosures and ratings can facilitate the progress towards the objectives of the EU Green Deal. Unfortunately, something is not working completely.
That's okay. It's usually happening in those webinars. There we go.
Yeah, here we go. So it's, yeah, so as I mentioned, the history starts much earlier, but basically in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a new global sustainable development framework, so the so-called Agenda 2030, which has as its core the Sustainable Development Goals. And then there was the Paris Agreement adopted and accepted by the European Union, which set specific measures that sought to strengthen the response to climate change. With this, the European Commission published a number of guidelines related to environmental and social disclosures. They were non-binding, but also set the tone for the European businesses. And of course, then 2019, the infamous SFDR, so Sustainable Finance Disclosures Regulation, and a package of a broad range of new laws aiming at accelerating the change towards sustainable economy and circular economy. Now we speak 2022, the EU taxonomy started to apply, and there are ongoing market consultations regarding the ESG ratings. The European Commission keeps open the consultation until 6 June. EFRAG just opened consultations about ESG corporate reporting. So the new proposed corporate sustainability reporting directive and also sustainability due diligence directive, and a number of other initiatives that are just happening as we speak, literally.
I see. So those are all a very good framework to understand that even though the legislative side is coming up with consultations, the market forces are well ahead, and companies that look to capitalize should pay attention, really.
Well, let's see whether that would be a concluding remark on our session, because I think, and this is really like an invitation to brainstorm, that there are a few or a number of big questions for the businesses and for impact investors in particular. So a number of opportunities, of course, has been created by the EU Green Deal and this huge sustainability movement. But then the questions remains how we should actually measure the impact. There are challenges in measuring and reporting the ESG impact in aligning internationally. And exactly how the ESG reporting standards and regulations can interplay with the EU Green Deal goals and the impact investing as such. So a number of issues, a number of questions I know our clients and businesses are just considering, and that's I think the tone and what I would like to touch during our session today. And if I may ask Dieter maybe to start and yes, comment on what I have just said, but also from your perspective, Dieter, whether you see E as indeed the biggest winner of the ESG investing trend, and I was wondering what kind of opportunities you see for companies, for investors seeking deal opportunities in in this field, in EU Green Deal, EU taxonomy context?
Thank you, Veronica. Yes, as you know, that the EU taxonomy is a science-based classification system which established the list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. And the taxonomy as such plays a predominant role, not only in scaling up sustainable investments, but also, as you have mentioned already, it is very, very instrumental for the implementation of the Green Deal. Because for companies, investors, and policymakers as such, the taxonomy regulation for the first time ever creates a clear framework for the concept of sustainability and exactly defines when a company or enterprise is operating sustainably or environmentally friendly. Previously, there have been, of course, also this reporting on, let's say, green activities or sustainable activities, so-called, but everybody has had its own criteria, what could be considered as being sustainable. This is now over, and that's the first conclusion of it. It's if you compare now this for companies with competitors that are still living under the old system, companies and investors that are aligned with their activities under the taxonomy, they stay out positively, and then they can benefit from higher investments and also better investment opportunities. In this way, the taxonomy creates first and foremost security for investors because they have this robust and clear defined system. It protects private investors from greenwashing, which was a big issue so far. It helps also companies to become more climate friendly and help, of course, shift the investments where they are most needed. Now, if I start with the investors, I mean, it is clear that the investors will now ask the businesses how their activities are aligned to the EU taxonomy. Because the EU taxonomy is kind of a bedrock of many financial mechanisms at EU level, where the taxonomy has already now a kind of spillover. And the European institutional investors and asset managers will have an obligation to disclose how their sustainable fund aligns to the taxonomy. And thus, investors and financiers will ask the companies in which they, or in the activities they invest, how aligned their activities are to the taxonomies. And for the companies, this means that they have now to get started by assessing whether their activities are taxonomy aligned, so that you can bring together those activities with the investments. And then another important point I want to make here is that the EU taxonomy is not only affecting the businesses within Europe, but also beyond Europe. As you know, the financial markets, they are global. And the taxonomy will therefore have implications for global businesses. Let's imagine that you have a business with a European investor. This investor very likely will be asking the question about the alignment with the EU taxonomy. And also European companies which are operating globally, they will likely to apply the EU taxonomy lens to their global operations. So one can say, while the taxonomy is a European regulation, it will have a lot of implications for foreign markets that conduct business with Europe. And even if Europe is a first of this kind in terms of this taxonomy system, we also see already that other markets have started to look into their green list certification system, if you like. I can mention here Canada, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, ASEAN, or the United Kingdom. They are at different stages in the development, and is it a consultation stage or evaluation? But they are coming and working. And I think the way that the European Union has advanced here will also give them a bit a push so that they will finalize it. Now, in a nutshell, when you are asking what are the benefits are clearly that this taxonomy approach brings together the policy objective, the green transition towards the 2030 and 2030 minus 55 greenhouse gas emission and 2050 a net zero economy, net zero carbon economy, that this taxonomy approach will bring together the investors, the companies, and the policymakers in order to work together towards this. The taxonomy, therefore, is a very, very important tool. And with the disclosure obligations, reporting obligations, it will also make the necessary push on the investors and the companies, and we see that already happening in the markets, that they will advance even their strategies in order to decarbonize their businesses.
Thank you. So it's really, as you said, it impacts all market players, so companies, investors, but also in financing institutions, and as you said, those who are non-EU entities. But Kenza, if I may ask you maybe, because it's extremely interesting that you represent an impact investor. So basically a kind of the investment activity that really targeted or has targeted even before EU taxonomy. There is specific goals. So on top of the financial returns, which is a must for every investor, you also have this target of reaching a selected ESG goal in every deal. So if you can expand on this, and also referring to what Dieter said about the opportunities. How do you see it?
Absolutely, Veronica. Thank you very much. Maybe I can start by presenting Mirova and our activities. So Mirova is a committed player in sustainable finance. And as you said, we are searching for combining financial performance and environmental and social impact. So what we try to do at Mirova is to direct capital flows towards the needs of investment in real, sustainable and value-creating economy. And so we do that by trying to increase our positive impact on environmental issues and also on trying to reducing inequalities. And so within the real assets division of Mirova, the private equity fund, which we call Mirova Environmental Acceleration Capital, that we will call MEAC, was launched last year in 2021. And so this fund is an environmental private equity fund. And so we target pan-European companies with strong ESG standards in 5 key thematics in link with the environment. So these thematics are natural resources management, agri-agrotechnologies, circular economy, clean energy, and smart cities. And so what we believe as private equity investors is that we have a critical role to play in order to help companies scale up their business, their impact plans. And so we do that by providing acceleration capital to these innovative technologies companies which are trying to tackle burning environmental issues. And so we're not alone by doing that. There are many private equity and venture capital firms which are investing in companies which provide environmental technologies, but only few firms are really focusing their strategy on contributing to the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. But some funds are doing it, such as Blue Earth Capital or Meridian and Mirova also. Mm-hmm. And so, as you said, one of the main questions in impact is the measurements of impact. How do we quantify that? What do we say by impact? And so this is why at Mirova, we have developed our own methodology on impact assessment and monitoring. So I can say a few words about that. So when we invest in a company at Mirova, we implement what we call an impact plan. And so this impact plan, basically, it's used to identify the impact levels of the company, and we will monitor these KPIs over the term of the investment. And so for each KPI, we will associate a target that we want to reach at exit. And so each impact plan will be audited at exit to confirm that we had dual benefits, which is, of course, financial performance, but also an environmental impact. And to demonstrate our real commitment to impact at Mirova, we decided that 50% of the carried interest of the investment team will be conditional to the achievement of these targets. So, and to monitor this impact, we require for each company that they report their progress on the achievement of these objectives every semester.
And do you then, okay, there will be also like a time to make a deeper dive into this. What I was also trying to find it out before our session is to really like differentiate the impact in investors or impact investing PE funds among those or from those who has just the ESG tag, because everyone needs to report under the sustainability reporting disclosure regulation. So basically this is something that I think needs or calls for an answer. But I was wondering whether you attach to this impact plan like financial metrics, that there is a special bonus for the GPs or some extra benefit for the LPs that is related to achieving impact specifically?
So our impact plan, so we really want to demonstrate the environmental benefits of the company. But of course, this is often linked to the business plan of the company, because when the company achieves its targets, when the company expands its business, well, this automatically has a link on its production and on, for example, if the company has developed a technology which has an impact, well, the more the company will sell its technology, which is linked to its business plan, well, the more it will have an impact. So the two are quite linked.
Okay, sure. So then Silvio, because you are like quite a different hat, you are wearing a different hat, also representing an investor, but for a private debt financing and a turnaround kind of investments, it's more difficult, more nuanced to embrace the ESG trend. You cannot simply say, I buy receivables from ESG robust companies only, because they are usually not robust at all. So I'm wondering, what's your view on the impact investing and in this EU Green Deal and ESG context in particular, of course?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the question, which is very interesting. As you said, Veronica, we have a fairly different strategy from what Kenza just described at Mirova. Let me maybe start with a more general comment around the fact that typically private debt investors and credit funds have lagged behind other asset classes, obviously impact funds, but also private equity in terms of embracing ESG. And that has always been one sort of key characteristics of private debt investor. But that is actually changing, and it's changing fairly rapidly and very dramatically too. Just a couple of data based upon a research that was conducted by PwC. So it is estimated that by 2025, the aggregate amount of sustainable assets under management for private debt investors in Europe would be a number between 80 billion euros to 120 billion euros, which translates into a share of the aggregate sort of AUM, asset under management for private debt investors, that might be in between 20% to 40%. So a fairly big number. And I think, also the PwC research shows that the vast majority, 50%, I would probably say the majority of GPs for private debt sort of funds have already committed to not effectively launching any non-ESG initiatives and non-ESG funds within the next few years and by 2025. And I think those data are actually borne out by anecdotal evidence as well. And when we discuss with potential LPs, and that is one sort of characteristic emerging all across the private debt market in Europe, I would say, we are asked questions about ESG that we were previously not asked. I think there are sort of three key points that LPs are very focused on at the moment. The first one, and this probably circles back to what Dieter was saying before, is in connection with climate risk. So how we effectively factor in climate risk as part of our overall investment strategy, and whether we equate climate risk to investment risk, how do we manage it? The second key question, obviously, is more general around ESG, and so how do we integrate ESG all across our overall sort of investment arch and investment process? And the third one clearly is around data collection and reporting. I think investors also, and again, that comes up fairly quickly in conversations with LP, are no longer satisfied with being described in very abstract terms, a general approach or strategy to ESG, and which are future intentions of the GP in connection with ESG, but they want track record. And again, that is a big sort of difference from the past few years. And also track record from my own perspective probably is more important than the actual label of the fund under the SFDR. So when you talk with investors or you, in particular European LPs, they consider the fund being labeled as an articulate fund as a given. So everyone does that now. And so that doesn't set the GP apart, because every GP has an articulate product. It is much more interesting for an LP to be pointed towards proven track record of the GP in connection with ESG engagement, ESG efforts, and ESG transformation of companies. Now, if I have to look at the various sort of dimensions of ESG in connection with the sort of private debt market, I say that obviously ESG operates as an exclusion mechanism, and that is fairly obvious. So a few funds and a few investors will not invest into certain asset classes or certain companies that have sort of fairly limited credentials from an ESG perspective. The second dimension, which is very important from our perspective, is again equating climate risk with investment risk. And so how do you factor in the transition towards a net zero economy and the overall, transformation of the economy towards a reduction of greenhouse emission in your investment process? And when you diligence a company, do you take that into account? And that, again, is another sort of key dimension in ESG for private debt. The third one, I think, is the incredible rise of sustainability-linked loans, which have now pretty much become a standard. I think both from the perspective of traditional lenders, so banks and other financial institutions, as well as for, let's say, alternative providers of capital, so your typical sort of credit funds. And that could be either of a combination of mechanisms whereby there's a margin ratchet that is a function of the ESG performance of the borrower, or specific ad hoc covenants, obligations, and undertakings on the part of the borrower to perform from an ESG perspective. As you said, probably it is slightly different from those turnaround funds or special situations funds or CLOs that invest in the secondary market, in particular that acquire portfolios of loan receivables that have already been granted by financial institutions and that have a standard set of terms that cannot be amended when the investor steps in, because obviously you do not have the ability to effectively diligence probably as analytically as you might want the underlying asset, and obviously you don't have any contractual lever to change the terms of the agreement. And so I think probably the approach in that particular case is lend from a non-ESG perspective. And so when you lend, obviously you cannot fully take into account ESG considerations, but you do that when you either refinance or when you invest into the company, for instance, by swapping a piece of your receivables into equity.
Yeah, so there must be an element of ownership control to have an
Absolutely.
ESG.
Absolutely. Yeah, from my perspective, that is crucial. Otherwise, you don't have the governance levers to. Obviously, you can resort to engagement, and clearly, probably credit funds have more engagement levers than traditional lenders, than banks. But I think the key game changer is when you get governance leaders and you can actually, appoint your own board of directors and steer the company towards an ESG transformation.
Yeah, exactly. Joe, would you like to comment on this? Your expertise is very much like ESG focused, but more from corporate compliance perspective and the global perspective. So I'm wondering whether you agree with us that E is the biggest winner, and with the opportunities that Klaus, Dieter, Silvio, and Kansas see for impact investing.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I do come at it from a bit of a different perspective, and I'm certainly, I'm absolutely not an environmental specialist. I'm really a corporate lawyer, and corporate governance has been my way into ESG. So maybe I see it differently for that reason, but I mean, it's certainly the case that when we started talking about ESG and this sort of, using this unified umbrella term in common parlance, talking with our clients a few years ago, the focus was very much on the E. And even more than that, I would say the focus was probably quite narrowly on climate, on emissions and greenhouse gases. And one can imagine why, the sort of pressing climate emergency was really coming up everyone's agendas. So very much focus on E. But what we've been seeing over the last few years is a kind of broadening of the ESG focus, I suppose, from a corporate perspective. From our multinational clients that we work with, they're really thinking about this in quite a broad way. So when we're talking about the E, we're not just talking about climate, we're talking about water usage, we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about single-use plastics, packaging, waste. But even sort of, beyond that, beyond the E, I mean, it's become a sort of bit of a cliche, but I definitely think it was true that during the pandemic from 2020 onwards, what we started to see was a bit more of a focus on S. And so, people were, the front of mind was the impact of the pandemic and everything that flowed from it on the workforce, on communities, and broader social issues. And so that really did bring the S to the fore. And then I suppose, towards the end of last year, certainly in the UK where I'm based, COP26 meant there was a lot more focus again on the E. And certainly in terms of the hard law around this, a lot of the reporting legislation that we're going to be talking about probably a bit later, and we've already touched upon, has been focused on E and emissions in particular. In the UK, we've now got mandatory reporting that's based on the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures framework, and we saw announced in the last few months in the US, the SEC bringing in mandatory reporting for certain companies in relation to climate issues, environmental issues. So still, the E is very much the focus of the legislators. But it's not exclusively so. You touched, Veronica, earlier on the supply chain due diligence legislation in the EU, and other domestic legislatures have introduced similar things in Germany, for example. And that's very focused on I mean, broad issues in the supply chain, yes, but the human capital issues. And so so I think, maybe I'm not quite sure I do fully agree with the premise that the E is the big winner. I mean, certainly it's the headline grabbing one, but the S factors are very much part of this. And I suppose one sort of last thing I would say as a governance specialist is the way I see the G of ESG is not really as a third category. I think the G is absolutely central. I think it's what allows an organisation of whatever stripe to deliver on its promises around the E and the S. So the governance is really at the centre of this. And, so I'm talking about corporate governance in the sort of traditional sense that I advise on. Company law, director duties, who's on the boards, how do they delegate authority to executives, who takes responsibility for at those levels for ESG matters. But I suppose I'm also talking about ESG governance in its broader sense of, how is the organisation geared up, tooled up to deliver on its E and S promises, and how is it incentivised, and how are those functions who have a role to play in that delivery, how are they held accountable? I think that governance part is absolutely key and certainly shouldn't get forgotten.
Yeah, I fully agree, and exactly as you said, this governance part may help prevent greenwashing. And there is a very interesting question in our chat function that actually dovetails nicely with what I wanted to ask Dieter around this enhanced ESG reporting regime that is just being proposed, and in 2024 will be the reality for all large companies, all listed companies on regulated markets, and quite a broad number of entities doing business in European Union will be facing this new obligations. So it's like now the NFRD, so non-financial reporting directive, like covers roughly 11,000 entities. With these new regulations coming into force, it is expected to cover tens of thousands. So building on that, Dieter, and also answering on this question, do you think that these regulations, the disclosing new regulations and the EU taxonomy itself are sufficient to help differentiate a solution, a technology, a company that can indeed have a positive impact on transforming an economy, or from a one that is really like greenwashing, impact washing? What would be your, sense in that kind of differentiation, or the need for such a differentiation?
Look, first I would like to make a comment, because we are talking about ESG. Okay, governance is one thing, but I personally am not an ESG expert as such, but for me, environmental issues and sustainability issues are intrinsically linked. So it's very, very difficult for me, if you are doing something which is sustainable and it touches, of course, also the environment, then this is going hand in hand. So I have sometimes difficulties to differentiate between the environmental impact as such and the sustainability impact. But coming to your question, and you rightly said, I mean, for me, the two go clearly together. The taxonomy alone would not be sufficient. But now with the disclosure obligations that are enhanced in the mandatory sustainability reporting, the EU together with the taxonomy, in my view, is it already 100%? I don't know, but it is a huge way forward compared to what was done, as I said before, where companies demonstrating the ESG performance just through an own reporting. Now, what makes a real difference here is that the taxonomy listing and alignment is assessed on the basis, as I said, on science-based objective criteria. This brings two things to the market. It brings transparency, and it brings comparability. And these two components also mean, to me at least, if it is handled correctly according to the rules, that the greenwashing that we have seen in the past should be excluded. I cannot exclude that you will here and there still see some efforts in order to greenwash the one or the other activity, but through the transparency and the comparability, you will detect that, and you will easily come to the conclusions whether it should be aligned or should get the label being taxonomy aligned or not. And another thing is important. We are at the beginning of the taxonomy development. We have only, out of the 6 objectives, we only have tackled 2. So it's a dynamic framework, and over time we will even establish it further. So what I would say here to the companies is taxonomy cannot be ignored. And businesses are well advised that they should leverage the taxonomy to drive the sustainable transformation, and also to use it to underpin their own long-term decarbonization strategies. And when you now, with a transparency and the comparability that is brought to the markets through the taxonomy and the disclosure obligation, in my view, it is over that you can go to the market and just use your products or activities and just branding it as green. Now you have to demonstrate clearly that you are fulfilling all the objective criteria, that you are aligned in under the rules. And this, in my view, has already been realized by a number of companies, because a lot of, especially also the bigger companies, they have started to give themselves their decarbonization strategy with very concrete target dates where they want to have achieved the strategy. So the strategies are currently developed. And I can only really hope that the companies are doing it, taking in all the rules that are currently in place and will be put in place in future.
Okay, so may I understand that you are in favor of the detailed, not to say complicated, reporting obligations?
Look, in favor, I think one has to see. At the beginning, you always have to do something very robust, and maybe, I mean, I personally have not read all the 100 pages on the technical rules, etc. Is that too much? I really don't know. But what I know is that by using them, exercising them, and as I said, it's a dynamic framework. Yeah. We should be open. If something has gone too far, then we have to address it and make it more applicable or better applicable. I think this we have to accept, and also the Commission should then take the necessary measures. But if you are at the beginning already too vague and just giving again very vague concepts, then you cannot combat all the allegations that certain activities or products are just greenwashed. And I think that is the most important, because here we need to convince through convincing and also mandatory rules. And everybody has to obey to them. And once we are there, I think you can then release certain obligations or make them easier to apply. But at the beginning, I think it is as it is. And you know, if too many experts are sitting around and writing these rules, then we get what we got.
At the beginning, it's a challenge and extra cost for those who are obliged to report. However, I do agree, or at least this is what I can see, that there are ongoing consultations, so like EFRAG and the Commission. So now I presume there is like a huge effort, or at least an intention to somehow match the requirements, the legal developments that we are just seeing being shaped with the voice from businesses. However, yeah.
It's a very important point, Veronica. I just wanted to say, because here also we as lawyers can play a role, because we have already the first clients that came to us and are now confronted to do the reporting in 2022 and then later 23 even more so, that they try together with us, that we are working out templates for them, which in the companies they can easier fulfill it, and we have to make sure that these templates are established in a way that they are 100% conform and compatible with the rules that are set out in the annexes of the taxonomy, for instance, for the different activities. And I think that this might also over time reduce then the costs for the companies. And I like very much, and I was involved in one of these projects, I really like the idea to establish for the major activities of a company these templates where then they can do the reporting and we then take the responsibility that it is compatible. I think that's a way also forward to help the companies.
But then there comes an additional challenge or an extra level of challenge for multinational companies, because aligning templates for European Union may not work globally. And I'm wondering, Joe, what's your view on this? Because there is a lot of consultations or attempts to set the only one binding standard in not only in Europe, yes, but the UK has its own set of attempts in unifying the reporting standards, and the US and other jurisdictions that are also key or might be key for companies. So what does it mean to have a global standard? And
yeah, I agree, Veronica. So I think this is a conversation that I have with clients. You know, most Baker McKenzie clients are multinational corporates, and this is probably the question that I get asked most often, is around how can they take a kind of globally aligned approach to ESG reporting, or you know, and should they? I suppose is maybe the other question. And I think it's partly because, you know, we have been on several sort of speeds in different jurisdictions, different regions around the topic of ESG reporting. I mean, in the UK over the last several years, even sort of prior to Brexit, we had this absolute sort of mushrooming of domestic legislation around ESG reporting. We didn't always call it such. You know, we talked about specifically around emissions reporting with our streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulations. We talked about reporting on diversity and inclusion issues like gender pay gap. We talked about human capital issues like modern slavery reporting. And also, you know, we have specific corporate governance reporting in the UK, which is still quite unusual. So we had this sort of mushrooming of quite disparate legislation in the UK, all of which was leading to reporting on, you know, broad ESG and sustainability issues. But it wasn't, you know, even harmonized even within our jurisdiction. You know, there were different sources of those obligations. They went into different places. You know, in some cases you had to put them on the report on a register. In some cases it just went in your financial statements. In some cases there was a specific requirement for board approval, in others not. So, you know, a bit of a mishmash. And that was just within the UK. Then when you layer on, you know, the fact that multinationals are operating sort of across regions, you've obviously got the overlay of EU law, and then potentially some differences in the way that things are implemented domestically within the EU member states. And then you've got the US, which has been in quite a different place around ESG. You know, much less focus on the reporting. Probably a bit more focus on sort of investor pressure and sort of market-driven pressures around ESG and concern about things like litigation risk. But you know, the way that multinationals had to approach ESG reporting really varied there, with probably the exception of California. Businesses that have a large presence in California were having to report on modern slavery and other sort of supply chain issues. But as a result, it's really hard for multinationals to know what to do. And for the most part, they're really trying to do the right thing. They're trying to be compliant, but they're also understanding the need for this careful reporting around ESG matters, because they know it's important to their investors, to their workforce, their customers, the wider community. But what's not always clear to them is how to do it. So it's not always clear, to what extent they can kind of leverage group-wide data and group-wide initiatives and talk about those in respect of, individual country reporting, because very often that's supposed to be done, at the entity level. So if you've got a UK subsidiary or a European subsidiary of a US multinational, then it's that entity or that group of entities that's supposed to be doing the reporting. It's not enough to simply say, oh, we do all this stuff at kind of parent company level or group level. So to what extent can they use that data to ensure local compliance, but at the same time be globally aligned? So I think it becomes really important to sort of look a bit behind the kind of specific country reporting, and when you're looking at it as an investor or a stakeholder of some description, and think, really, what is this organization? What is this multinational group doing? Are they articulating a kind of clear approach? Generally, are they acknowledging, as they absolutely must, that there's always going to be work to do, not least because ESG, as we've talked about, it's not one fixed thing. It's not all about net zero targets, important as they are. It's an absolutely dynamic landscape. So, how are they going to sort of react to changes in that ESG landscape? What's their governance, as we talked about? How are they measuring success internally?
Yeah.
But
yeah. Sorry. Finish your thought, Jo. Sorry, I didn't intend to.
No. I think I was coming to the end of it. I mean, it was really broad. I suppose what I'm really saying is that the disparate sort of nature of the reporting obligations as they're cropping up in different jurisdictions means that it is a real challenge for multinationals to be consistent in their reporting. But I think trying to kind of, as from an investor's perspective, maybe sort of trying to kind of look behind those reports to those sort of underlying themes, it therefore becomes important.
Yeah. Thank you. And basically, yes, I was probably rushing to share my thought that the global reporting and the global reporting standards may also affect in a positive manner a well-informed investment decision. Just recently, the world has been watching how a global market player, a certified B Corp, lost two well-known PE funds from the auction sale process over purported ESG underperformance. Yes, notably a third bidder, also a PE fund, completed the deal. So it must have happened based on either a different view on ESG DD findings or a different approach to it, or maybe they were convinced that as a new owner, they can fix and identified ESG issues. So there are a number of considerations. There's a number of considerations that an investor should or may take into account at the outset of the M&A transaction and due diligence process. And I'm wondering, Silvio and Kenza, but Silvio in particular, like from your experience, from your perspective, what are the recommended ESG-related checks and balances that an investor should consider when making a decision whether to invest or not?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I think this is an exercise that probably comprises two key elements. The first one is looking at the company in isolation, and the second one is looking at the company as part of the portfolio of the investor, and how does the company fit within the overall ESG investment strategy for that particular investor. So as regards the looking at the company in isolation, so one key aspect clearly is due diligence. which has several dimensions, I think. The first one is strategic due diligence through the lenses, as we were saying before, of how will ESG factors or ESG consideration have an impact on the business of the company within the, let's say, investment period of the fund. So what's going to happen to the company from an ESG perspective in the next 5 years? If the company is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, or if the company is a big emitter of carbon dioxide, how is that going to impact the financial performances of the company within the investment period of the fund? I think a second element is probably relating to ESG, assessing ESG risk, not only from a strategic perspective, but from a broader perspective that also includes legal risk and compliance risk. And I'm probably going to pick up a few points that Joe mentioned before. So obviously one key element of the due diligence will be in connection with litigation risk, which is on the rise pretty much across the globe, I would say. So obviously there are some regions where litigation is a step ahead than other regions, but that is a global trend, and we probably expect that trend to be truly global and to increase all across the board in the next few years. And litigations might mean potentially several things. Might mean director duties and directors' liability, parent company and vicarious liability, liability in connection with your ESG disclosures potentially, and obviously liability for pollution or environmental damages. And I think that the entry into force of the corporate sustainability due diligence will force investors, again, not to look at individual companies, but to make that assessment all across the board, including the entire key value chain of the company, which obviously is going to be a fairly big exercise. And I think another piece of the jigsaw, which is very important, and again, this probably circles back to what Joe was saying, is around the S and the G. Let me probably start with a comment on the G. I couldn't agree more with Joe that, G, governance, is an overarching element of ESG that cuts across the entire ESG framework, and it's absolutely fundamental. So G has always been one of the sort of key prerogatives of sophisticated investors and private equity funds or credit funds. So how you operate on governance of your portfolio companies, how you make sure that the corporate governance of the portfolio company is such that it's robust enough for the company to grow and perform and deliver values. I think another key element is an assessment in connection with anti-bribery and anti-corruption. And ESG can actually have an impact on that assessment. And that is fundamental from a reputational perspective. So again, if I look at the sort of S element of the ESG framework, probably the S element is the single element that can have the most profound impact on reputation, so on the, let's say, overall reputation of the portfolio company, but clearly also the investor. And that is, I would probably say, let's say the due diligence, looking at the company in isolation. But then again, the other sort of key component of the exercise is looking at the company as part of your overall portfolio and how does the company fit within your overall ESG strategy, which means looking at ESG integration. And again, there are sort of various dimensions to this. KPI and monitoring and data collection clearly is one. So how does the company fit into your KPI sort of framework and your sort of data collection and monitoring tool, whether any adjustment is required, who will be responsible within the company to feed data to the GP so that the GP has all of the relevant data to disclose to its investors. Again, governance is absolutely fundamental. And how will you appoint a board of directors that will be managing ESG as a priority and will set the tone for the entire organization? Because in our experience, if that doesn't happen, it is very, very difficult to deliver ESG transformation. And then obviously another, say, key piece of the jigsaw is how you prepare the company for an exit. And so how can you prove your transformation journey within the company from an ESG perspective? Will you be preparing an ESG vendor due diligence, for instance? How do you actually pin down the actual results that you have obtained from an ESG perspective when you prepare the company for an exit.
Kenza, what are your thoughts? I saw you nodding, but I'm also thinking I'm wondering whether you would change your due diligence methodology in light of the coming regulations, or you have it already in your checks and balances?
Yeah, I was wondering that I was completely agreeing with what Silvio said, because I also think that the due diligence is the cornerstone in impact investing. It is key to assess ESG practices and measure the contribution of a company to the SDGs. But to do that, we need data. And in my view, one of the main obstacles to not only the development, but also the normalization of impact investing is the lack of consistent and standardized extra-financial data from companies. Because as you may know, one of the three pillar of impact investing, it's the measurability of impact, the two others being the intentionality and the additionality. But so for this measurability, basically we say that the investment decision cannot rely only on the intuition of the impact. We must really demonstrate the social or environmental benefits that the company has. And we have to do that in a quantitative manner, not only qualitative. And so today, this lack of standardized extra-financial data is clearly one of the main obstacles to measuring impact. And so at Mirova, we are convinced that not only standardized, but also transparent, accessible, and easy to use ESG data will help promote and deploy impact investing. And I think that we are quite lucky in private equity because we have direct touch with the management of the companies in which we invest. And so to have all of this data, well, we have a lot of interactions with them. And so we have like quite an easy way to have all the necessary information that we need, which is not the case in the listed market, for example. And so this is why I think that more broadly, to accelerate the mainstream, if I can say the mainstream of impact investing, the public sector generally has an important role to play by pushing for the implementation of regulations and legislation that will impose on every actor, on every asset class to make the public information necessary to investors so they can demonstrate this impact. And so I think that in Europe, the legislators have already did a great job. They have led the groundwork for an ambitious framework for sustainable finance. They have helped strengthen the integration of ESG in the transparency requirements of investment funds, which is a great thing. So yeah. So then, okay, so we have this ESG due diligence, like a new must-have at the very outset of the investment decision. But then, if you don't pass the test, and that's actually my question, and I will seek Klaus-Dieter and Silvio's maybe thoughts on this. But then there will be an abundance of companies that fail that test, yes, traditional energy companies that struggle with transformation into a sustainable one. Lots of stranded assets, and not wanted by anyone. Banks refusing credit facilities because they will risk their own ratings. Is it a challenge, an opportunity? And yes, maybe Dieter, what are your thoughts? Because you are like an energy sector expert, and I think the biggest challenge, or maybe one of the biggest challenge, when we seek ESG robust companies and sustainable economy, the biggest challenge is for traditional companies, traditional energy companies in first place.
Yeah, the traditional companies, in my view, they cannot just declare that we are going to become 100% taxonomy aligned, because that would mean really that they have to divest all assets relating to activities that are not listed in the EU taxonomy. Take now all those companies that are still having coal in their activities, coal-fired power plants, for instance. And all the other activities also need then to become 100% taxonomy aligned. For me, in such a case, these traditional companies, they have to look for, in my view, a more reasonable target. And that would be to say that using the established criteria under the taxonomy, the companies should assess which of their economic activities are already considered environmentally sustainable. And then these companies can consider appropriate interventions to reduce potential regulatory and financial risk from activities that are not aligned with the taxonomy. And on that basis, they can then explore the opportunities associated with adjusting the activities that are not yet aligned, if they do align it. And that has to do, they look at the development of the ETS price and these kind of things. So if they make these assessments, then I see it more the kind of dynamic evolution of their businesses. I cannot rule out that you will end up with certain stranded assets. Yes, I think it's inevitable in this context. But for most of the companies, it should be possible to develop a strategy where they can do that in a more dynamic way, and also comparing the risks and the opportunities that are there. So unfortunately, for those traditional companies, there is no silver bullet in this. Take, for me, the worst example are the refineries. They have absolutely no future whatsoever if they continue with their current activities. So they have to start from scratch. And this transition from scratch, I mean, they have to convert their business, their activities into synthetic fuels. And that means that they have to start now building in parallel a completely new business and divesting over time from the one they have. So, but I know there are examples out there, refineries that have done this plan, and those I know, they are confident that they can manage it, but it's not easy. That one should underline. It's a very, very painful process. And some are right by saying this transformation we are undergoing within the next 20, 25, 30 years is as brutal as it was the industrialization in the 19th century.
You mentioned this stranded asset. I'm wondering really whether with this new proposed corporate sustainability reporting directive, a sale will be sufficient, because companies will be obliged to report in this third reporting stream about the entire supply chain and all the supplier they cooperate with in their business activities. So yes, on one hand, a question whether the increased reporting standards will result in an increased number of stranded assets, what to do with them, and how to transform them. That's the challenge, I presume. Plus, yeah, I think a sale is just not sufficient. But Silvia, I'm looking very much forward to your view on this. It's like you are dealing in stranded assets business.
We are. So let me start with a comment on what Dita just said, which again I totally agree with, which is that we are in a phase of profound transformation. and such profound transformation that it will have to be disruptive. And so, as Dita said, a few businesses will be disruptive, and we do expect an increase in stranded assets. I think, again, from the perspective of a private debt investor, for two key reasons. First of all, because it is likely that non-ESG aligned company will be completely locked out of capital within a not too distant future. And I think, again, if we look at the rise in sustainability-linked loans, if we look at the tectonic shift, as the CEO of BlackRock said, in the allocation of capital towards ESG and sustainable investment, it is likely that those companies that are not ready to transform their business model, or that have very limited or poor credentials from an ESG perspective, will have a very hard time to either access loan financing, debt financing, or tap the capital markets, or seek investments from private equity. And then the second reason, and again, looking at the let's say distinctive feature of the private debt market, is that we expect traditional lenders, and so banks and financial institutions, to seek to deleverage their portfolio of non-ESG aligned receivables and loans. And that is also in part of the regulatory and the prudential sort of pressure, prudential regulation pressure, that they will be having to do that. And if I look at the approach that the ECB, for instance, has taken, but it's not only the ECB, it's also the Bank of England and quite a big number of regulators across the globe, to encourage banks and to stress test banks against the climate risk, for instance. And in climate risk, from the perspective of the ECB, means both the transition risk, and so how do you sort of price your portfolios of receivables and the credit worthiness of your borrowers, taking into account the transition towards a net zero economy. Will the borrower be capable to pay the debt back if its business model is likely to be completely transformed by that transition? But also the physical risk. And so how will, for instance, extreme weather events potentially impact infrastructure, big infrastructure projects, or agriculture? So we do expect potentially sort of traditional lenders to increasingly deleverage their portfolios of non-ESG aligned loans. And so that might potentially result in quite a huge number, or a vast number of stranded assets on the market, which obviously creates sort of turnaround opportunities. And again, I agree with Dita that is the challenge for each company, trying to identify which portions of the business, and it might not be all, obviously, can be adapted to effectively be aligned to a new sustainable paradigm. I just sort of wanted to make one example of a deal that is sort of fairly that we were involved with in the Italian market, in connection with a shipping company that didn't go into trouble because of ESG, but that was purely related to financial performance, but how that company leveraged on ESG to reposition itself in the market by effectively a combination of purchasing vessels that are eco-friendly, and so completely transforming its fleet to reposition the fleet to a sort of more eco-friendly basis, and also by employing quite a number of strategies of carbon offsetting. And so effectively repositioning itself as a shipping company that has already begun its journey towards sustainability, and that actually allowed the company to turn around the business and to reposition itself in the market in a good way, I would say.
Yeah. Thanks so much. But you mentioned earlier this litigation risk for increased that may be a result of more detailed, more transparent reporting. But I'm wondering, based on what you have just said, whether it is realistic, given the current situation globally, that we will meet the zero neutrality targets without risking energy capacity gaps. Yes, I hear you that there will be a lot of stranded assets. Kenza, I believe, would disagree with investing into a heavy transition risk company. So how to reach to this ambitions, 2030 goals, 2050 goals, with this energy capacity risk being quite realistic, I would say. I know, Kenza, Dieter, would you like to maybe share your view on this?
Yes, of course. So as you mentioned, I think that the challenges are great to achieve the objectives of the Green Deal. And although finance is somehow part of the problem in the climate crisis, in my opinion, finance is definitely a source of solutions, and it's also a vector for change. It's a vector for impact. And so at Mirova, we meet every day with passionate entrepreneurs who are developing innovative technologies and solutions in very diverse sectors in order to achieve various objectives set by the Green Deal. To list a few, we, for example, met with a company which has developed a modular and plug-and-play technology that converts unused energy from engines and industrial facilities into clean electricity that you could use right away. We met with another company which is specialized in low carbon wood-based modular construction. And so the company provides solutions in construction to create buildings mostly made out of low carbon and biosource materials. And so this company tackles the challenges of reducing CO2 emissions.
I'm not sure whether it is my connection or we just lost.
All of this at a competitive cost. And so I think that all of these examples and our day-to-day job give us faith that things are moving in the right direction. And this is why I think I'm being optimistic in the fact that we could achieve the objectives which are set by the Green Deal if we continue in that path. And of course, if we also have all of the regulations and legislations which comes in hand to achieve all of these objectives.
Dieter, do you agree?
I fully agree, because we should not make the mistake here that we are currently in an energy capacity gap situation, or call it even in security of supply, energy supply difficulty, that we take this now as a kind of excuse that we would not aim at fulfilling the 2030 targets or 2050 targets. That would be a mistake, a big mistake. I think one should separate these two things. Yes, we need transitional measures in order to make sure that the gap, the capacity gap, is not impeding on the security of supply. So the lines have to stay on. You will see the Commission either next week or the week after will come with concrete proposals based on the Repower EU communication, where one tries to tackle these security of supply issues. And they are serious, and we should not take that easily. No, but they are, of course, there. That might also lead to keep, for instance, coal-fired power plants longer in the reserve as initially planned. Natural gas, LNG, will play a more important and longer role as initially planned. But on the other hand, this situation is also a new another wake-up call that we have to accelerate the increase of renewable energy sources, be it electricity, be it gaseous renewable energy. And for this, we need, for instance, shorter permitting periods, a better planning, these kind of things that really boost the development. There's a lot of bottlenecks still in the development of renewable energy. And my hope is that the situation in which we are in will give this push that we might get faster to the renewable targets that we have set for 2030. What I've heard just today is that the Commission might even come in this new package with increased renewable targets for 2030. I personally do not know whether that is something that is achievable, because quite honestly, I believe that the targets, the -55, is already quite ambitious, especially when you look that it means 67% of the renewable electricity, or electricity has to be renewable. So these are already ambitious targets, but for me, it's not a problem of the target setting. It is really that we should separate the security of supply issue that needs concrete answers, immediate answers, but we should not give up on our targets. And the taxonomy plays a very important role there. It will remain a very important tool for the green transformation, because if we would now loosen it or even suspend it or whatever, we would really give up on the tool, as we have heard, the financing that is so important in order also to develop the renewable side. So the financing and the acceleration of the increased deployment of renewable energy, that goes hand in hand and cannot be dissociated.
Thank you very much. And I see that we are like reaching the end of our session in a moment, but just building on what you have said, and also building on a question that I find very interesting, that I see in the chat function, that the companies may actually declare themselves as reaching or targeting the zero carbon emissions and actually operate in another country. So I don't know whether it somehow interplays with what you have just said about the even increased targets, and also this litigation risk Silvio mentioned, yes, that companies will declare certain aims or set certain goals for themselves, make an ESG statement, make zero carbon statement, and then simply operate from elsewhere. I don't know who would like to pick up on this one. I know there is a few like ESG related litigations that you at least follow or monitor in your role. Do you see it as a risk?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. I think it's an interesting one because, because the more we focus on clarity of reporting and globally aligned reporting measures, and generally kind of thinking about sort of quality of information for investors, and in order to allow them to sort of make better comparisons between companies, the more in some ways the companies sort of, I suppose, expose themselves to risk around liability for false statements or for misleading statements. So, I mean, I think in this area, as in so many things, it really is around kind of being very clear in your approach, and ensuring that, whatever you're putting out there in terms of your reporting, whether it's around aspirations to net zero, whether it's around the steps you're taking to try to achieve net zero, you've got kind of clarity on what's real, what's verifiable. You can stand behind that data. What's aspirational, and being kind of clear about what's aspirational, but also what governance you have in place to try to achieve those aspirations. But I think for sure we're likely to see more litigation in this space. The litigation that we've seen hasn't, always been around sort of misreporting or misinformation in annual reporting. Sometimes it has been, there've been other kind of routes to claim, and some of the most sort of prominent litigation that we've had in the US and the Netherlands has been, more around a sort of duty of care hook, which I think would be there, sort of notwithstanding whatever companies put in their annual reports. But I think we are likely to see, we're likely to see a lot of these trends continuing. Yes, sort of more litigation risk. As I said before, that's something that US clients are particularly concerned with because they come from a much more litigious environment. But I think it's becoming a greater risk for major multinationals operating in Europe too. I think we're likely to see more sort of stakeholder activism, shareholder activism. We're seeing that in the current annual report and annual meeting season. We're seeing pressure around environmental topics, yes, but also things like unions, and other workforce issues. So we're likely to see more of that activism, and we're likely to see more media scrutiny. And all of those things sort of, will be underpinned, I think, by the greater wealth of data that will be out there around reporting, and then, what all these this new reporting legislation is, and the harmonization of existing reporting standards. What all of it's driving at is trying to achieve greater transparency and substance, and getting away from greenwashing. And I suppose it sort of follows from that if you get it wrong, then there is real risk, real legal risk, as well as reputational risk. But I think one of the examples you gave earlier, Veronica, was interesting because around a prominent player who has B Corp status for certain of its entities, that was itself involved in a sort of ESG scandal that that impacted a deal that it was trying to do, and led to some investors sort of shying away from the target. What I think is really interesting about that is that it shows there aren't really kind of good guys and bad guys in this. I mean, maybe there are some definitely bad guys, but even the good guys are not getting it entirely right. And, and nor, I guess, can we expect that, given how sort of complex, as we talked about before, the ESG landscape is and how fast moving it is. So, so I suppose that sort of leads to the point that actually we're not just talking here about litigation risk or reputational risk for those bad actors, for those who are not aboard the ESG train. We're talking about those risks arising even for corporates that are absolutely committed to doing the right thing and have all the right things in place, including, as Silvio was saying before, a board of directors that really understands the strategic importance of ESG and wants to integrate ESG factors into their decision making. That doesn't mean that they will not face any risk in this area.
That sounds like a very nice summary of our discussion. I would add to this challenges around measuring impact. Yes, that's actually a key theme for making a wise M&A decision. Would you like, Klaus, Dieter, Kenza, Silvio, would you like to share your maybe takeaways?
Yeah, maybe if I might just pick up on what Joe just said, which I completely agree with. I think talking about the last questions, I think there are two dimensions. The first one is the litigation risk, and I think Joe covered all the relevant sort of aspects of that: parent company liability, disclosure liability, shareholders activism. I think there is also another key dimension from my perspective, which is the dimension of the market. And that is a force at the very least as powerful as the legal and regulatory framework. And so I'm not sure whether you would get away with just spinning off one sort of the polluting part of your business and relocating to another country and not just sort of be held accountable by investors.
I could not agree more on that. I mean, the litigation side, we have seen it already with concrete examples. Also, the judges, they are very, very open to come forward with some surprising, as a lawyer, I can say, some surprising verdicts in this area. So that might even continue. And on the other side, I'm personally believing, I mentioned that other countries than the EU are also working on something like a green certificate scheme or so. This will grow globally, and therefore to spin off certain bad parts or brown parts or black parts to other countries, that might work just for a short period of time. Because I think this development of taxonomy will be a global development and not only a European one.
Absolutely. Would you like to? Sorry, Chris.
Just wanted to say, yeah, I'm here to offer opportunity for anyone else wishing to offer some closing remarks. By no means, I don't wish to end the conversation prematurely, but it's been so wonderful listening to everyone offering a very panoramic view of the issue. It's certainly been very educational for me. And I want to also thank our audience. I believe, Veronica, you very kindly offered to share your slides with anyone wishing to get more information. It seems like we're at a point where there's a lot of positive trends and they are only expected to continue. So I'm very happy to hear you talk about those. Just checking if there's any concluding comments. If not, I would just think it's just a testament to how much there is to be said when our experts really fill up the time to talk, and it feels like this is a conversation that could easily carry on for a while. So I would encourage our audience to reach out to our panelists with any further questions, because this is very much a conversation that needs to be carried on. But for now, we will be sharing a recording of this conversation fairly shortly online for anyone wishing to revisit. And I believe that this is a good point to close the conversation and to thank our panelists and our audience for participating. Thank you all very much. And we'll look forward to speaking with you again very soon.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.